The maintenance bay of the Imperial starship Eternal Dominion hummed with the quiet efficiency that befitted the flagship of Empress Zilara's fleet. Chief Mechanic Jake Morrison wiped grease from his hands as he finished replacing the hyperdrive coupling, his human features standing out starkly among the elegant, crystalline forms of the Veltar crew members who gave him a wide berth. 3 months had passed since the Terran Confederation had signed the integration treaty with the Veltar Empire, and Jake remained one of only 12 humans aboard the massive vessel. The others whispered about him in their melodic language, their translucent blue skin shimmering with patterns he couldn't read. They called him the crude one when they thought he couldn't understand, but Jake's neural implant caught every word. The ship's intercom crackled to life with an announcement in High Veltar. Emergency in the sacred chamber. All personnel to maintain distance. The Empress's elite guards were responding. Jake frowned, checking his work tablet. The sacred chamber wasn't on any maintenance schedule he'd seen, and his clearance level should have granted him access to every system on the ship. Curiosity getting the better of him, Jake gathered his tools and made his way through the ship's gleaming corridors. The Veltar he passed moved with obvious agitation, their skin patterns cycling through rapid color changes that his implant translated as fear and reverence. Something was seriously wrong. As he approached the restricted section, the temperature began to drop noticeably. Frost formed on the corridor walls, and his breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. The ship's environmental systems should have compensated immediately, but they seemed to be struggling against whatever was happening in the sacred chamber. 2 elite guards stood at attention before massive doors carved from what looked like crystallized starlight. Their ceremonial armor gleamed with embedded gems that pulsed with inner light, and each carried a weapon that hummed with barely contained energy. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the Empress's personal protectors, beings who had undergone genetic enhancement and cybernetic augmentation to become the perfect warriors. Human. One guard spoke, his voice carrying the harmonic overtones that marked him as nobility. You are not permitted in this section. Return to your designated areas immediately. Jake held up his hands peacefully. I'm getting temperature alerts from this section. The environmental systems are failing. If there's a malfunction, I need to check it out before it spreads to other parts of the ship. The guards exchanged glances, their skin patterns flickering with uncertainty. The temperature continued to drop, and now ice was actively forming on every surface. Jake could hear something from beyond the doors, a deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate through the ship's hull itself. The sacred chamber maintains its own environment, the second guard said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words. The Zephyrian hibernates within. It cannot be disturbed. Jake's implant immediately began searching its database. Zephyrian, a species he'd never heard of, which was unusual given his comprehensive xenobiology training. The sound beyond the doors grew louder, and now he could feel it in his bones. It wasn't mechanical. It was breathing. Look, I don't know what a Zephyrian is, Jake said, pulling out his diagnostic scanner. But whatever's in there is drawing massive amounts of power and dropping the temperature to dangerous levels. If this keeps up, your hibernating friend might freeze to death, and it'll take half the ship's life support with it. The guards' skin patterns now showed clear distress. They were trained to protect, but their duty to the Empress and her ship conflicted with their orders to keep the sacred chamber sealed. Jake watched them struggle with the decision, noting how their enhanced physiology was already adapting to the cold that had him shivering despite his thermal gear. A new voice echoed down the corridor. Empress Zilara herself, accompanied by her full retinue. The guards immediately dropped to one knee, but their eyes remained fixed on the doors that were now covered in a thick layer of ice. What is the situation? The Empress demanded, her voice carrying absolute authority. She was tall even by Veltar standards, her skin a deep royal blue marked with silver patterns that indicated her bloodline, her eyes large and multifaceted like cut gems, fixed on Jake with obvious suspicion. Your Majesty, the first guard reported, the human claims the sacred chamber's systems are malfunctioning. The temperature has dropped significantly, and the Zephyrian's breathing patterns have changed. Empress Zilara's expression darkened. Impossible. The Zephyrian has maintained perfect hibernation for over 2 centuries. It is the guardian of our bloodline, the living symbol of our empire's strength. No mere malfunction could affect it. Jake stepped forward, ignoring the way every weapon in the corridor immediately tracked his movement. Your Majesty, I don't pretend to understand the cultural significance of what's in there, but I know systems failure when I see it. That breathing pattern, it's not hibernation. Something's going wrong, and if we don't act soon, you're going to lose whatever's in there. The Empress studied him for a long moment, her faceted eyes reflecting the ice-covered lights and patterns that hurt to look at directly. You would dare to suggest that our most sacred guardian requires the intervention of a human mechanic? I'm suggesting that your sacred guardian is a living being, and living beings need life support systems that work properly. Jake replied, meeting her gaze despite every instinct screaming at him to look away. Whatever's wrong in there, it's getting worse by the minute. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and now the ice was spreading down the corridor toward them. The Empress's retinue moved closer to their leader, but their enhanced physiology could only compensate for so much. Jake's human metabolism was already struggling, but his stubborn streak had gotten him through worse situations. If you're wrong, the Empress said slowly, if you damage or disturb the Zephyrian in any way, you will die in ways that your species has never imagined. Jake nodded grimly, and if I'm right and we don't act, it dies anyway. Your choice, Your Majesty. The breathing sound beyond the doors suddenly stuttered, became irregular. Even the elite guards couldn't hide their alarm now. The Empress closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Jake saw the weight of 2 centuries of tradition warring with the practical needs of the moment. Open the chamber, she commanded. The crystalline doors split apart with a sound like singing crystal, revealing a chamber that defied every law of physics Jake thought he understood. The room stretched impossibly far in all directions, its walls seeming to curve away into infinity, while simultaneously feeling intimately close. Bioluminescent patterns flowed across surfaces that might have been organic or technological. Jake couldn't tell the difference, but none of that held his attention for more than a heartbeat. In the center of the chamber, surrounded by a complex array of monitoring equipment and support systems, lay the Zephyrian. It was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. Easily 30 feet long, its body combined the sleek power of a great cat with the deadly grace of something evolved for the hunt between stars. Its fur appeared to be made of living shadow that shifted and flowed like liquid night, occasionally revealing glimpses of skin that sparkled with embedded crystalline structures. 6 limbs ended in claws that looked capable of rending starship hulls, and its head bore a crown of crystalline horns that pulsed with the same rhythm as its labored breathing. Mother of God, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber. The elite guards flanked him immediately, their weapons trained on his every movement, but Jake barely noticed. His mechanic's eye was already cataloging the problems. The support systems surrounding the creature were clearly malfunctioning. Crystalline conduits that should have been flowing with energy were dark or flickering erratically. The atmospheric processors were cycling through emergency patterns, and the temperature regulators were fighting a losing battle against some kind of feedback loop. It's beautiful, Empress Zilara said softly, stepping past her guards to approach the chamber's center. My ancestor Empress Valara found it drifting in the void between galaxies. It was young then, barely larger than a Veltar child, and dying from wounds we could not understand. She saved its life, and in return it swore a blood oath to protect our bloodline for 1,000 generations. Jake moved closer, his scanner beeping rapidly as it tried to process readings that made no sense. How old is it now? We estimate 800 years, though time moves differently for its kind. It has been in hibernation for the past 2 centuries, growing stronger, waiting for the day our empire faces its greatest threat. The Empress's voice carried a mixture of reverence and worry. The prophecies say it will awaken when that time comes. Well, it's trying to wake up now, Jake said grimly, studying his scanner readings. These support systems, they're not just life support. They're some kind of stabilization field, and they're failing catastrophically. One of the elite guards stepped forward, his skin patterns showing deep suspicion. You speak as if you understand technology that has existed since before your species left its birth world. Jake looked up from his scanner, meeting the guard's enhanced eyes without flinching. Energy is energy, and life support is life support, regardless of who built it. Your crystalline technology is incredibly sophisticated, but the basic principles are the same. The creature's metabolism is accelerating beyond what the systems can handle. As if to prove his point, the Zephyrian's breathing became more labored, and a low growl emerged from its throat that made the chamber's walls vibrate. The sound carried an undertone that spoke directly to the most primitive parts of Jake's brain, screaming predator with such intensity that his hands began to shake. "The awakening should not happen like this," the Empress said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "When it wakes naturally, the process takes months. This is violent. Wrong." Jake moved to the nearest bank of crystalline conduits, ignoring the way the guards tracked his every movement. These power flows, they're fighting each other. It's like the system is stuck in a feedback loop, pushing energy through pathways that can't handle the load. He paused, studying a particular cluster of dark crystals. "I think I know what's wrong." "Explain," the Empress commanded. "Your technology is biological, isn't it? These crystals, they're alive in some way. They grow, they adapt, they learn." Jake pointed to the failing conduits. "But they've been doing the same job for 200 years. They've become specialized, efficient, perfect for maintaining hibernation. They don't know how to handle anything else anymore." The Zephyrian's growl deepened and one massive eye opened. It was the color of a dying star, shot through with veins of silver that pulsed with inner light. That eye fixed on Jake with an intelligence that was ancient and utterly alien, and suddenly every person in the chamber felt like prey. "It sees you," one of the guards whispered, his voice barely controlled. "The Zephyrian sees the human." Jake forced himself to hold that terrible gaze even as his instincts screamed at him to run. "The system's trying to wake it up too fast. It's like forcing someone awake from surgery while they're still under anesthesia. The body starts fighting itself. Can you fix it?" the Empress asked urgently. The temperature in the chamber was now swinging wildly between freezing and tropical, as the environmental system struggled to compensate for the creature's changing metabolism. Jake studied his readings, his mind racing through possibilities. "Maybe. But I'd have to manually reroute the power flows, basically teach the crystals new pathways. And I'd have to do it while they're under full load." He looked up at the Empress. "I'd have to touch them directly." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the Zephyrian seemed to pause in its labored breathing. "Impossible," the first elite guard said flatly. "The crystalline matrices are keyed to Veltar biosignatures. Any other contact would cause catastrophic system failure. Or it would kill you instantly," the second guard added helpfully. "The energy feedback would cook your nervous system in seconds." Jake looked at his scanner readings again, watching the power fluctuations grow more erratic by the minute. "Maybe. Or maybe your bio-locked systems just need someone with a different kind of nervous system to break the deadlock." He met the Empress's gaze. "Human neural architecture is different from yours. Cruder in some ways, but more adaptable. We don't have your natural harmony with crystalline technology, but that might be exactly what's needed here." The Zephyrian's second eye opened, and its head turned slightly toward Jake. The movement was small, but in a creature of that size it felt like watching a mountain shift. The ancient intelligence in those stellar eyes seemed to be studying him, measuring him in ways he couldn't understand. "If you're wrong," the Empress said quietly, "you die and the Zephyrian dies with you. If you're right, you will have touched the most sacred relic of our empire with human hands. Either way, you will have changed everything." Jake hefted his tools, feeling their familiar weight. "That's what mechanics do, Your Majesty. We fix things that are broken, even when we don't fully understand how they work." He turned toward the failing crystalline matrix. Especially then. The elite guards raised their weapons, ready to fire at the first sign of system damage. The Empress watched with the weight of 8 centuries of tradition on her shoulders, and the Zephyrian's ancient eyes tracked Jake's every movement as he approached the bio-locked crystals that no non-Veltar had ever dared to touch. Jake extended his hand toward the nearest crystalline conduit, his fingers inches from the pulsing surface. The crystal thrummed with energy that made his teeth ache, and he could feel the heat radiating from its biomechanical surface. Every instinct screamed at him to pull back, but the Zephyrian's increasingly labored breathing drove him forward. "Wait," Empress Zilara said sharply. "Before you proceed, understand what you are about to do. This creature is not merely sacred to us. It is the living embodiment of our empire's covenant with forces beyond your comprehension. If you harm it—" "I get it," Jake interrupted, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chamber's wildly fluctuating temperature. "But right now your sacred guardian is dying because its life support system is stuck in a loop it can't break. Sometimes you have to risk everything to save what matters most." The first elite guard stepped closer, his weapons targeting laser painting a red dot on Jake's chest. The human shows disrespect to her Imperial Majesty. Perhaps we should stand down, the Empress commanded, though her faceted eyes never left Jake's face. Continue, human. But know that your life hangs by the thinnest of threads. Jake nodded grimly and pressed his palm against the crystalline surface. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Energy surged through his nervous system like liquid fire, carrying with it information that his human brain was never designed to process. He saw the ship's entire power grid laid out in his mind like a vast living organism. Every conduit, every processor, every life support system appeared as flowing rivers of light interconnected in patterns of impossible complexity. But more than that, he felt the Zephyrian's presence in the network. The creature wasn't just connected to the systems. It was partially merged with them, its consciousness distributed through the crystalline matrix during its centuries of hibernation. Jake could sense its confusion and pain as the automated systems fought against its body's natural awakening process. By the ancient stars, one of the guards whispered, the crystals are accepting him. How is this possible? Jake gritted his teeth against the burning sensation in his neural pathways and began to trace the power flows with his consciousness. The biolocked systems responded to his touch like an instrument he'd never played but somehow understood. Where Veltar technology relied on harmony and natural resonance, Jake's human stubbornness forced the crystalline matrices to adapt, to find new pathways around the deadlocked circuits. Through the connection, he felt the Zephyrian's awareness touch his own. The contact was brief but profound, a glimpse of intelligence vast and ancient, carrying memories that spanned eons. The creature had seen the birth and death of star systems, had hunted through the void between galaxies, had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Yet beneath that cosmic perspective, Jake sensed something unexpectedly familiar, the simple, desperate desire to live. The power flows are stabilizing, Empress Zilara reported, her voice tight with amazement. The metabolic readings are approaching normal hibernation parameters. Jake pushed deeper into the system, following the worst of the feedback loops to their source. What he found there made him curse under his breath. A cascade failure in the primary bioregulatory matrix had created a self-reinforcing cycle that was slowly burning out the supporting infrastructure. It would have taken the ship's best engineers weeks to trace the problem through conventional diagnostics. But Jake didn't have weeks. He had minutes at most before the energy feedback overwhelmed his nervous system entirely. Already he could feel his human physiology beginning to shut down under the strain. His vision blurred, and his heart rhythm became erratic as alien energies coursed through his body. Human. The Zephyrian's voice resonated directly in his mind. Ancient and powerful beyond measure. You are dying to save me, why? Jake forced himself to maintain the connection even as pain lanced through his skull. Because it's what we do, he replied through the crystal matrix. We fix things, we help. It's who we are. Your species is young and crude, the Zephyrian observed, though Jake sensed no malice in the words. Yet you risk your brief existence for one you have never met. This isn't unexpected. Yeah, well, humans are full of surprises, Jake managed, rerouting the last of the problematic power flows. The feedback loop collapsed and suddenly the chamber's environmental systems began functioning normally. The Zephyrian's breathing deepened and steadied, its massive form relaxing as the metabolic crisis passed. But the strain had been too much. Jake felt his connection to the crystalline matrix beginning to fray as his nervous system reached its limits. Electrical burns traced patterns across his skin, where the energy had overwhelmed his cellular structure, and his implant was throwing critical system warnings. The linkage is destabilizing, the Empress called out. He's losing neural cohesion. Jake tried to pull back from the connection, but the crystalline matrices had adapted too well to his presence. They were trying to hold on to him, to maintain the link that had saved the Zephyrian's life. He could feel his consciousness being drawn deeper into the ship's biomechanical nervous system, threatening to trap him forever in a maze of living crystal and alien thought. Let go, he whispered to the crystals, but they couldn't understand. They only knew that his presence had solved the crisis, and losing that presence meant potential system failure. I will not forget this debt, the Zephyrian's voice echoed in his mind. You have given me life, human. Now let me return the favor. The ancient creature's consciousness surged through the crystalline network, its vast experience allowing it to interface with the matrices in ways Jake never could. With surgical precision, it began severing Jake's connections to the system, forcing the crystals to release their hold on his neural patterns. "Sleep now, Guardian," Jake heard the Empress whisper as his consciousness pulled back from the alien technology. "Return to your rest. We will watch over you." The last thing Jake saw before unconsciousness claimed him was the Zephyrian's stellar eyes, fixed on him with an expression that might have been gratitude. Then darkness rushed up to meet him and he knew nothing more. When he woke, he was in the ship's medical bay, surrounded by concerned Veltar physicians and the persistent beeping of monitoring equipment. His body ached as if he'd been struck by lightning, and the neural burns on his skin would probably scar, but he was alive. More importantly, the ship's environmental systems were running smoothly again. The crisis had passed and the Zephyrian had returned to its peaceful hibernation. Jake had succeeded, but the implications of what he'd done were only beginning to sink in. He had touched the most sacred relic of the Veltar Empire, and lived. He had communicated directly with a creature older than human civilization, and he had proven that sometimes the crude, stubborn approach of humanity could succeed where elegant alien solutions failed. The door to the medical bay opened, and Empress Zilara entered alone, her royal guards remaining in the corridor. She approached Jake's bed with an expression he couldn't read, her faceted eyes reflecting the medical bay's lights in complex patterns. "You did something impossible today," she said quietly. "My advisors are still trying to understand how you survived contact with biolocked crystalline matrices. My priests are debating whether your actions constitute blasphemy or miracle." Jake tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in his burned neural pathways. "And what do you think, Your Majesty?" The Empress was quiet for a long moment, studying his scarred face with those ancient, multifaceted eyes. "I think," she said finally, "that we have greatly underestimated your species, and I think that the Zephyrian's awakening even briefly was not coincidence." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Rest well, Chief Mechanic Morrison. I suspect that your real work aboard this ship has only just begun." 3 days passed before Jake was cleared for duty, and when he finally returned to his quarters, he found everything had changed. His cramped maintenance worker's cabin had been replaced with spacious accommodations near the ship's command section. The walls were lined with crystalline interfaces that responded to his presence, and a viewport showed the swirling colors of hyperspace as the Eternal Dominion traveled toward the Outer Rim territories. More significantly, his access clearances had been upgraded to levels he'd never dreamed possible. Every system on the ship was now open to his inspection, from the basic life support networks to the quantum engines that drove them between stars. The trust implied by such access was staggering, especially for a human who had been aboard for only 3 months. A soft chime announced a visitor. Jake opened the door to find Captain Thessa Vortai, the ship's second-in-command, waiting in the corridor. Her crystalline skin showed patterns of deep blue and silver that Jake's implant translated as formal respect, mixed with curiosity. "Chief Morrison," she said, offering the traditional Veltar greeting gesture. "I hope your recovery has been satisfactory. The Empress requests your presence in the strategic planning chamber." Jake grabbed his diagnostic tools out of habit, then paused. "Strategic planning? That's not exactly a maintenance issue." Captain Vortai's skin pattern shifted to display what might have been amusement. "Indeed. However, your expertise is required for matters that transcend simple mechanical repair. If you would follow me?" The strategic planning chamber was located in the ship's most secure section, surrounded by layers of both technological and psychic barriers that made Jake's teeth ache. Inside, a holographic display showed a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy's outer rim, with several star systems highlighted in ominous red. Empress Zilara stood at the center of the display, accompanied by her senior advisors and military commanders. All conversation ceased when Jake entered, and he found himself the focus of dozens of faceted eyes. "Chief Morrison," the Empress said formally, "thank you for attending. We have a situation that requires your unique perspective." She gestured to the holographic display, and the view zoomed in on a particular star system, the Helix Nebula region. "Our scouts have detected unusual activity there, energy signatures that don't match any known technology. 3 of our exploration vessels have gone missing in the area over the past month. Admiral Kelthera, The fleet's military commander stepped forward. His skin showed the scarred patterns of a veteran warrior, and his cybernetic enhancements gleamed with martial efficiency. Initial analysis suggested natural phenomena, spatial distortions, perhaps a previously unknown form of stellar activity. However, the latest probe data indicates artificial origins. Jake studied the display, noting the strange energy patterns that seemed to pulse through the nebula's gas clouds. These readings, they're not matching anything in my database either, but the power levels are enormous. Whatever's generating them has access to energy sources that make your crystalline technology look primitive. Precisely our concern, the Empress said grimly, which brings us to why you're here. The Zephyrians stirred from hibernation precisely when these signals first appeared. Our cultural historians believe this is not coincidence. High Priestess Nalaran, an ancient Veltar whose skin had taken on the pure white of extreme age, spoke for the first time. The prophecies speak of the Zephyrians' awakening when the Empire faces its greatest threat. For 800 years it has slept peacefully. Now something has disturbed that sleep. Jake frowned at the display. You think whatever's in the Helix Nebula is connected to the Zephyrians' awakening? That seems like a pretty big leap. Perhaps, Captain Vortai said, but consider this. The creature you saved communicated directly with you through the crystalline matrix. No other being in recorded history has achieved such contact. If the Zephyrian wishes to convey information about this threat, you may be the only one capable of receiving it. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. They weren't asking him along as a mechanic or even as a systems expert. They wanted him to serve as a translator between the Veltar Empire and a creature older than their civilization. That's assuming it wants to communicate at all, Jake said. Our contact was pretty brief and it was focused on survival, not conversation. Empress Zilara moved closer to the display, her expression troubled. 3 days ago I would have agreed with you. However, since your intervention, the Sacred Chamber's monitoring systems have detected changes in the Zephyrians' hibernation patterns. It's dreaming, Chief Morrison, and those dreams are being recorded by our crystalline matrices. A new holographic display materialized, showing complex waveforms and data patterns that hurt to look at directly. These are the Zephyrians' dream memories from the past 3 days. Our xenopsychologists have attempted to decode them, but the thought patterns are unlike anything in our experience. However, when we ran the data through translation protocols based on your neural signature, the display shifted, and suddenly Jake was looking at star charts, not the precise technical displays he was used to, but something more organic, more alive. The stars seemed to pulse with inner light, and nebulae flowed like living things through the cosmic void. It was a view of the galaxy as seen by something that had traveled between stars for millennia. My God, Jake whispered, it's showing us the galaxy from its perspective. These aren't just star charts. They're hunting grounds. Hunting grounds where something is now trespassing, Admiral Kelthera said grimly. The Helix Nebula features prominently in these dream memories, and the associated emotional resonances are concerning. Jake studied the alien star charts, trying to understand what the Zephyrian was trying to communicate. The nebula region was highlighted not just as a location, but as something that provoked deep, primal responses in the ancient creature's mind. Fear was there, yes, but also recognition and something that might have been anticipation. It knows what's in the nebula, Jake said slowly. It's encountered this before, somewhere else, sometime else. He looked up at the assembled officers. And it's afraid. A creature that has hunted between galaxies, afraid of something hiding in our outer rim territories, the Empress mused. The implications are disturbing. High Priestess Nalaran stepped forward, her ancient eyes fixed on Jake with uncomfortable intensity. The prophecies speak not just of awakening, but of choosing. The Zephyrian will choose a champion to stand beside it when the great darkness returns. Given your unique connection to the creature, Chief Morrison, that choice may have already been made. Jake felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He was just a mechanic, trained to fix machines and solve technical problems. The idea that an ancient cosmic predator might have chosen him as some kind of champion was absurd. But the neural burns on his skin still ached from his contact with the crystalline matrices, and he could still remember the vast intelligence that had touched his mind in those crucial moments. The Zephyrian had saved his life after he'd saved its own. That created bonds that transcended species and understanding. What exactly are you asking me to do? Jake said finally. Empress Zilara turned from the display to face him directly. We're taking the Eternal Dominion to the Helix Nebula to investigate these energy signatures. Whatever we find there, we'll need someone who can communicate with our greatest weapon if it awakens again. You've proven capable of surviving direct neural contact with forces that would destroy any Veltar mind. And if the Zephyrian doesn't want to wake up? If it decides this threat isn't worth coming out of hibernation? The Empress's expression grew grim. Then we face whatever's out there with conventional weapons and hope our technology is sufficient. But Chief Morrison, something powerful enough to frighten a creature like the Zephyrian is not something I want to face without every possible advantage. Jake looked around the chamber at the assembled leadership of the Veltar, Empire's greatest starship, warriors, scholars, commanders, all of them looking to a human mechanic for answers he wasn't sure he possessed. When do we reach the nebula? He asked. 18 hours, Captain Vortai replied. Jake nodded slowly. Then I guess I'd better go check on our sleeping guardian. If something out there is scary enough to give the Zephyrian nightmares, we're going to need all the help we can get. The sacred chamber felt different when Jake entered alone. The elite guards remained outside at his request, though he could sense their nervous energy through the crystalline doors. The chamber's bioluminescent patterns flowed more rapidly than before, and the monitoring equipment showed activity levels far higher than normal hibernation should produce. The Zephyrian lay in the center of it all, its shadow fur rippling with patterns that suggested deep, troubled sleep. Occasionally, its claws would extend and retract, as if it were fighting something in its dreams. The crystalline horns on its massive head pulsed with a rhythm that matched no normal biological function. Jake approached the bio-locked interface panels, noting how the crystals began to glow more brightly at his presence. His neural burns tingled in response, the pathways he'd forged during the crisis still sensitive to the alien technology. He hesitated for a moment, remembering the overwhelming sensation of his first contact, then pressed his palm against the nearest matrix. This time the connection was smoother, more controlled. The crystalline network recognized his neural signature and adapted to accommodate his human patterns without the violent feedback of their first encounter. Jake felt his consciousness expand into the ship's biomechanical nervous system, following the pathways to where the Zephyrian's mind touched the network. What he found there nearly broke the connection immediately. The creature's dreams were a chaos of memory and instinct, filled with images of cosmic horror that spanned eons. Jake saw flashes of the void between galaxies, where things that weren't quite matter and weren't quite energy drifted in patient hunger. He witnessed the death of entire star systems, consumed by entities that existed in dimensions parallel to normal space. But beneath the cosmic terror, Jake sensed the Zephyrian's more immediate concern. It knew what was hiding in the Helix Nebula because it had encountered their kind before, in another galaxy, in another age. They were called the Void Feeders in the creature's ancient memory, beings that existed by consuming the life force of entire worlds, growing stronger with each civilization they devoured. "You're afraid we can't stop them," Jake said into the crystalline network. "You think they're too powerful for the Veltar Empire to handle." The Zephyrian's consciousness stirred, becoming aware of Jake's presence in the shared space of the network. "Not just the Veltar," the ancient voice resonated through crystal and thought. "The Void Feeders I knew before consumed 3 galaxies before they could be contained. Your human species, for all its crude determination, is still young. You have not seen what I have seen." Images flashed through the connection, worlds stripped of all life, their populations drained to feed entities that existed primarily in the spaces between dimensions. Entire fleets of advanced starships reduced to drifting hulks, their crews aged to dust in moments by weapons that attacked the flow of time itself. "Then why did you choose me?" Jake asked. "If we're too weak to fight them, why make contact at all?" The Zephyrian's response carried undertones of something that might have been hope. "Because your species does not surrender. In 800 years of observing the Veltar, I have learned much about civilized behavior. They are elegant, sophisticated, capable of great harmony and wisdom, but when faced with impossible odds, they calculate the cost and withdraw to preserve what they can." More images flowed through the connection, Jake's stubborn insistence on fixing the bio-locked systems despite the danger, his willingness to risk his life for a creature he'd never met. The human tendency to charge headfirst into problems that wiser species would avoid. Humans are different, the Zephyrian continued. You see impossible odds and consider them a challenge to overcome rather than a reason to retreat. It is crude, illogical, and often suicidal. It is also the only approach that has ever succeeded against the Void Feeders. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. You're saying we're going to war against entities that can consume galaxies? And your plan is to rely on human stubbornness? Partially, but there is more. The Zephyrian's consciousness pressed closer to his own, sharing memories that were older than Earth's recorded history. The last time the Void Feeders were stopped, it required a coalition of the most aggressive species in 3 galaxies, beings who valued survival over honor, victory over elegance. The Veltar would call them barbarians. Like humans, but stronger, more experienced, with weapons and tactics adapted to fight entities that exist partially outside normal space. The creature's ancient sadness flowed through the connection. Those species are extinct now, consumed by time and their own warlike nature. Humanity may be the last hope for developing such capabilities. Jake pulled back slightly from the mental contact, trying to process what he was hearing. The Zephyrian wasn't just asking him to serve as a translator. It was asking his entire species to become the galaxy's weapon against cosmic horrors. That's assuming we survive the first encounter, Jake said. From what I'm seeing in your memories, the Void Feeders don't exactly give species time to learn and adapt. True, which is why I have been preparing. The Zephyrian's consciousness expanded through the network, showing Jake systems within the ship that he hadn't known existed. Hidden throughout the Eternal Dominion were weapons of incredible sophistication, all keyed to crystalline matrices that could only be activated by someone with access to the biolocked networks. The Veltar built a warship without realizing it, the creature explained. Their technology is perfectly suited to fighting entities that exist in multiple dimensions, but their peaceful nature prevents them from recognizing the potential. You, however, understand both mechanical systems and the necessity of violence. Jake studied the hidden weapon systems through the network, his mechanic's mind automatically cataloging their capabilities. They were indeed sophisticated beyond anything he'd seen, designed to disrupt dimensional barriers and target energy patterns that existed outside normal space. But they would require precise coordination and a willingness to use them at devastating levels. You want me to turn the Veltar flagship into a weapon of war, he said. Slowly. I want you to turn it into a tool for survival. The Zephyrian corrected. The Void Feeders are already here, already beginning their harvest. Every hour we delay means more worlds consumed, more life force added to their strength. The time for peaceful solutions has passed. Through the crystalline network, Jake could feel the ship's proximity to the Helix Nebula growing stronger. Whatever was waiting for them, there was aware of their approach and preparing for their arrival. The energy signatures that had confused the Veltar sensors were actually feeding patterns, the cosmic equivalent of a predator savoring its prey. If I do this, Jake said, if I help you weaponize their ship and their technology, there's no going back. The Veltar Empire will be changed forever. All civilizations change when faced with extinction, the Zephyrian replied. The question is whether they change enough to survive. Your species has already begun that transformation, from a single world to a member of galactic civilization in mere decades. Now you must help others make the same leap. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on him like a physical force. He was being asked to make decisions that would affect the course of galactic history, to help transform a peaceful empire into something capable of fighting cosmic horrors. It was the kind of burden that should fall on leaders and generals, not on mechanics from small-town Earth. But as he considered the Zephyrian's words, he realized that maybe that was exactly why he'd been chosen. Leaders and generals thought in terms of politics and strategy. Mechanics thought in terms of fixing what was broken and making things work, regardless of how impossible the task seemed. Show me the weapons, Jake said finally. Show me how to wake up this ship's true potential. The Zephyrian's consciousness surged through the network with something that felt like fierce satisfaction. Now you begin to understand why I chose you, human. The Void Feeders believe they face a peaceful empire guarded by a sleeping predator. They have no idea that the empire now has a mechanic who can wake both the ship and its guardian. As knowledge flowed between them through crystalline pathways, Jake began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. The next few hours would determine not just the fate of the Eternal Dominion, but the future of every living world in the galaxy. Outside the sacred chamber, the ship continued its journey toward the Helix Nebula, where ancient horrors waited with the patience of eons. But now, for the first time in 800 years, those horrors would face something they had never encountered before: a human who refused to accept that some problems couldn't be fixed. The Eternal Dominion dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Helix Nebula, and immediately every sensor on the ship began screaming warnings. The nebula, which should have been a chaotic mix of gas and stellar debris, was organized into geometric patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate directly. Streams of energy flowed through the cosmic dust in designs that suggested vast intelligence and alien purpose. Jake stood on the bridge beside Empress Solara, watching the main display with growing unease. 3 hours ago, he'd emerged from the sacred chamber with knowledge that no human was meant to possess: the locations of hidden weapon systems throughout the ship, activation codes for crystalline matrices that had slept for centuries, and most importantly, the understanding that the Eternal Dominion had been designed as more than a flagship. It was a weapon. Energy signatures are off the charts, Captain Vortai reported, her skin patterns cycling through colors that indicated extreme stress. Whatever's organizing the nebula is drawing power from sources I can't identify. The scale is unprecedented. Admiral Kelthera studied the tactical displays with a warrior's eye. No ships detected, but these energy patterns suggest massive constructs hidden within the gas clouds. Multiple contacts, each one larger than our vessel. Jake activated his upgraded access codes, and suddenly the bridge displays showed information that made the assembled officers gasp in shock. Hidden sensors throughout the ship revealed the true scope of what they faced. The nebula contained not ships but entities, vast, living constructs that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human science couldn't properly describe. Void feeders, Jake said quietly. They're not hiding in the nebula. They are the nebula now. They've been feeding on the gas and stellar matter, converting it into extensions of themselves. Empress Solara turned to him, her faceted eyes reflecting the ominous glow from the displays. How do you know this? The Zephyrian showed me. These things have consumed entire galaxies before. They don't build ships or cities. They become their own infrastructure, turning everything they touch into part of their collective mass. Jake pointed to the energy flows visible on the enhanced displays. Those patterns aren't random. They're neural networks, spread across light years of space. As if responding to their observation, the energy patterns in the nebula shifted. The chaotic swirls of gas and energy began to converge, forming structures that defied conventional physics. Tentacles of living plasma reached across space toward the Eternal Dominion, each one large enough to engulf a small moon. Evasive maneuvers, Admiral Kelthera commanded, but Jake was already moving toward the crystalline interface that had appeared at his command station. No, Jake said, pressing his hand against the bio-locked surface. Running won't work. They exist in multiple dimensions. They can follow us through hyperspace. His consciousness expanded into the ship's network, following pathways the Zephyrian had shown him to systems that had never appeared on any blueprint. Throughout the ship, crystalline matrices that had been dormant for centuries suddenly blazed to life. Hidden weapon arrays emerged from what had appeared to be decorative hull elements. Power systems that had been operating at a fraction of their capacity routed energy into configurations that turned the flagship into something that could fight entities existing across dimensional barriers. Impossible, Captain Vortai whispered as the ship's true nature revealed itself around them. The Eternal Dominion was built as a vessel of peace, of exploration. It was built by the Zephyrian's guidance, Jake replied, his voice distant as he coordinated with systems that operated according to principles beyond Veltar understanding. Your ancestors thought they were following their own cultural inspiration. They never realized they were being subtly directed to create something that could fight the void feeders when they inevitably returned. The plasma tentacles struck the ship's shields, but instead of the devastating impact everyone expected, the crystalline barriers held firm. More than held, they began to drain energy from the attacking entities, feeding that power back into the ship's enhanced weapon systems. The shields are consuming their attacks, Admiral Kelthera said in amazement. How is this possible? Dimensional resonance feedback, Jake explained, though he was learning the principles even as he spoke them. The Zephyrian's knowledge flowed through the crystalline network, teaching him to operate weapons that had been designed by intelligence spanning multiple galaxies. The void feeders exist partially outside normal space. Our shields are pulling them deeper into our dimensional framework, where they're vulnerable to conventional attacks. The first of the ship's hidden weapons fired, a beam of crystallized space-time that carved through the plasma tentacles like a sword through smoke. Where the beam struck, the entity's matter was forced back into normal dimensional parameters, becoming solid, vulnerable, mortal. But the void feeders were ancient and experienced. They began to adapt, pulling their mass deeper into parallel dimensions where the ship's weapons couldn't reach. Jake watched the tactical displays shift as the entities changed their approach, becoming less aggressive but more dangerous. "They're learning," he warned. "These things have fought advanced civilizations before. They know how to counter new weapons. Then we must be more adaptable than they are," Empress Zilara said grimly. She moved to her own command station, her royal access codes unlocking systems that even Jake hadn't known existed. "All ships of the Imperial Fleet, this is Empress Zilara. Emergency protocols are now in effect. The Empire is at war." Across the communication networks, Jake could sense the shock and confusion as peaceful exploration vessels received orders to activate weapon systems they hadn't known they possessed. But the Veltar were nothing if not disciplined. Within minutes, the entire fleet was responding to the crisis with the efficiency that had built their empire. It wasn't enough. The void feeders had had eons to perfect their methods. As the Imperial fleet engaged the entities throughout the nebula, Jake watched more and more ships fall to attacks that bypassed conventional defenses. The entities were learning faster than the Veltar could adapt, incorporating each new tactic into their collective knowledge base. "We're losing," Admiral Kelthara reported grimly. 17 ships destroyed, 23 more severely damaged. The enemy is adapting to our weapons faster than we can deploy them. Jake felt frustration building as he watched the tactical displays. The Veltar were fighting with courage and skill, but they were thinking like a peaceful civilization forced into war. They were trying to minimize casualties, to preserve their beautiful ships, to find diplomatic solutions even in the face of entities that existed only to consume. Through the crystalline network, he felt the Zephyrian's consciousness stirring more fully awake. The ancient predator was responding to the battle, its predatory instincts triggered by the scent of conflict. But it was still fighting against centuries of hibernation, still struggling to fully engage with the physical world. "We need to wake the Zephyrian completely," Jake said suddenly. "The void feeders are winning because they're fighting a civilization. We need to unleash something that thinks like a predator. The awakening process takes months under normal circumstances," Captain Vortai protested. "We don't have that kind of time." Jake studied the biomechanical interfaces surrounding him, noting how they pulsed with increasing urgency as the battle raged outside. "Then we don't do it the normal way." He began routing power from the ship's weapon systems into the sacred chamber's crystalline matrices. "The Zephyrian is already partially conscious through the network. If I can establish a deeper connection, feed it enough energy, maybe I can accelerate the process." "That could kill you," Empress Zilara said. "The neural feedback from a forced awakening will probably fry my brain," Jake agreed. "But right now, that's better than letting these things consume the galaxy." He looked around the bridge at the assembled officers, seeing fear and determination in equal measure. "Besides, somebody once told me that humans don't surrender when faced with impossible odds." Before anyone could stop him, Jake plunged his consciousness fully into the crystalline network, following the pathways to where the Zephyrian's vast mind lay dormant. Behind him, the battle for the galaxy raged on, but he no longer had attention for anything except the ancient predator whose awakening might be there. Only hope for survival. It was time to wake up something that could teach the void feeders what it meant to be hunted. Jake's consciousness plunged into the deepest layers of the crystalline network, where the Zephyrian's mind resided in dimensions that human thought was never meant to navigate. The entity's awareness was vast beyond comprehension, spread across eons of memory and experience that spanned multiple galaxies. Awakening it fully was like trying to rouse a sleeping mountain. "Wake up!" Jake poured every ounce of his determination into the connection, feeling his human neural pathways burning under the strain. "They're here. The void feeders are here and they're winning." The ancient consciousness stirred, recognizing the urgency in his thoughts. But centuries of hibernation had left the Zephyrian's connection to the physical world tenuous at best. It could sense the battle raging outside, could feel the deaths of Veltar ships through the crystalline network, but its massive form remained locked in the stasis that had preserved it for so long. The awakening requires time. The creature's thoughts resonated through crystal and bioelectric patterns. My physical form has been dormant too long. The neural pathways must be rebuilt gradually. We don't have gradually. Jake forced more energy into the connection, feeling his own life force being drawn into the process. Around him, the ship's hidden weapon systems were failing one by one as the void feeders adapted to each new tactic. Your people are dying out there. My people will be next. Images flashed through the network. Imperial ships being consumed by entities that fed on dimensional energy. Their crews aged to dust in seconds as the void feeders drained the life force from entire star systems. The entities were methodical, efficient, turning each victory into additional mass and power for their collective consciousness. Then we must try something unprecedented. The Zephyrian's consciousness suddenly blazed with ancient fury. Human, your neural patterns are crude but adaptable. If you can serve as a bridge between my consciousness and my physical form. Jake understood instantly. The creature wanted to use his human nervous system as a temporary interface, routing its vast awareness through his brain to reach its hibernating body. It would almost certainly kill him, but it might also wake the Zephyrian fast enough to turn the tide of battle. Do it, Jake said without hesitation. The connection exploded into painful brilliance as the Zephyrian's consciousness flooded through Jake's neural pathways. His human brain, never designed to handle such vast intelligence, began to shut down under the strain. But even as his individual awareness started to fragment, Jake felt the ancient predator's mind rushing through him toward its physical form. In the sacred chamber, the Zephyrian's massive body convulsed as consciousness returned to flesh that had been dormant for centuries. Its stellar eyes opened fully for the first time in 200 years, burning with intelligence that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. The crystalline horns on its head blazed with energy as neural pathways reconnected, and its shadow fur rippled with patterns that spoke of predatory intent awakening. On the bridge, every display suddenly showed the battle from a completely different perspective. Where the Veltar had seen chaotic entities feeding randomly throughout the nebula, the Zephyrian perceived a coordinated hunting pattern that spanned light years. The void feeders weren't just consuming matter and energy, they were building something. By the ancient stars, Empress Zilara whispered, as the tactical displays revealed the truth. They're constructing a dimensional gateway. They're trying to bring through more of their kind. The Zephyrian's voice resonated through the ship's communication systems, carrying harmonics that spoke directly to the predatory instincts buried in every sentient mind. All ships, this is the guardian of the Veltar bloodline. Implement hunting pattern Sigma immediately. Target the entity's dimensional anchors, not their physical manifestations. Admiral Kelthera's military training warred with his confusion. Guardian, our weapons cannot effectively target dimensional anchors. We lack the necessary technology. Negative. The Zephyrian replied, its consciousness now fully merged with the ship's systems. Your weapons were designed for this purpose. Chief Morrison, initiate the awakening protocols for all fleet vessels. Jake, his awareness now spread dangerously thin between his human consciousness and the creature's vast intelligence, somehow managed to transmit the activation codes throughout the Imperial fleet. Across dozens of ships, hidden systems that had been dormant for centuries suddenly came online. Crystalline matrices that had seemed purely decorative revealed themselves as targeting computers designed to track entities existing in multiple dimensions. The effect was immediate and devastating. Imperial ships that had been helpless against the Void Feeder's dimensional attacks suddenly became predators themselves. Weapons that could force entities back into normal spacetime fired in coordinated volleys, while shields that could drain energy from parallel dimensions turned the enemy's own power against them. But the Zephyrian was not content to coordinate from a distance. Its massive form rose from the hibernation chamber, moving through the ship's corridors with impossible grace for something of its size. Jake, barely conscious now, felt the creature's anticipation as it approached the main hangar bay. What is it doing? Captain Vortai asked, watching the internal sensors track the Guardian's movement. Hunting. Jake managed to whisper, his voice barely audible as his nervous system approached complete failure. It's going hunting. The hangar bay's massive doors opened directly to space, and the Zephyrian launched itself into the vacuum without hesitation. Its form, designed for travel between stars, moved through space as easily as a terrestrial predator moved through a forest. Shadow fur that wasn't quite matter rippled with energy patterns, while crystalline claws extended to dimensions that normal space couldn't contain. The Void Feeders, ancient and experienced as they were, had never encountered anything quite like the Zephyrian. Their collective consciousness registered the approaching entity as a significant threat, but their response was fatally delayed by confusion. Nothing in their eons of experience had prepared them for a predator that existed as comfortably in the void between stars as they did in parallel dimensions. The Zephyrian struck the nearest, Void Feeder like a living missile, its claws tearing through dimensional barriers that had protected the entity for millions of years. Where it struck, the creature's distributed consciousness was forced back into normal space-time, becoming vulnerable to the concentrated fire from the Imperial fleet. But the Guardian was not fighting alone. Through the crystalline network, Jake felt his consciousness being drawn deeper into the creature's awareness. His human perspective, crude and limited as it was, provided something the ancient predator had never possessed: the ability to see patterns on a smaller scale, to notice details that vast intelligence might miss. The central node, Jake's awareness whispered through the network. They're protecting something at the center of the nebula. All their feeding patterns, all their construction, it's designed to protect whatever's at the core. The Zephyrian's hunting instincts immediately locked onto this insight. Its massive form changed direction, no longer engaging the distributed entities but driving straight toward the heart of the nebula, where the Void Feeder's true purpose lay hidden. What they found there defied every law of physics Jake understood. A sphere of crystallized space-time hung in the nebula's center, its surface reflecting stars that existed in galaxies yet to be born. Inside that sphere, Jake could sense something vast and patient, not just another Void Feeder, but something that commanded them all. The Void Mother. The Zephyrian's thoughts carried tones of ancient recognition and primal fear. The first of their kind, the entity that spawned all others. It's been sleeping here for eons, waiting for its children to gather enough power to wake it. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. The Void Feeders hadn't been randomly consuming the galaxy's outer rim. They'd been following a plan millions of years in the making, gathering the energy necessary to awaken something that made them look like children in comparison. "Can we stop it?" Jake asked, though he could already feel his consciousness fragmenting under the strain of the connection. "We can try," the Zephyrian replied, its form beginning to glow with energy drawn from dimensions beyond normal space. "But it will require everything: your human stubbornness, my predatory instincts, and the Veltar Empire's willingness to sacrifice beauty for survival." Around them, the Void Feeders began to converge, abandoning their distributed feeding patterns to protect their sleeping mother. The final battle for the galaxy was about to begin, and Jake realized that his small role as a mechanic had somehow evolved into something that would determine the fate of every living world in known space. As his human consciousness finally began to fade, Jake felt a fierce satisfaction. He'd fixed the problem just like he'd always done. He'd taken something that was broken, the connection between an ancient predator and a peaceful empire, and made it work. Now it was time to see if that was enough to save everything they held dear. The Zephyrian roared its challenge across dimensions, the sound carrying the fury of a predator that had been patient far too long. The Void Mother stirred in its crystalline prison, ancient malevolence beginning to wake after eons of slumber. And throughout the galaxy, the outcome of a war that had been brewing since before humanity learned to make fire hung in the balance. But for the first time in millions of years, the Void Feeders faced an enemy that refused to accept defeat as an option. They faced the combined fury of an ancient guardian and the stubborn determination of a species that had never learned when to quit. They faced humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy, the absolute refusal to give up no matter how impossible the odds.